There were something close to 30 men in that room, and every single one of them heard it, and not one of them moved. The man who said it was Corporal Arthur Lindqvist, 23 years old, out of Duluth, Minnesota, and he was the lowest-ranking human being in that building, by a distance you could measure in entire careers. Around him stood colonels who had been running staff sections since Tunisia, majors with operational responsibility for road nets that carried 100,000 men, a brigadier who had flown in that morning from 12th Army Group and who had not taken off his coat. And at the map board, with a grease pencil in his fist and the next day's axis of advance already drawn in blue, stood the commanding general of the 3rd United States Army. Lindqvist was standing at the back, near the door, because that is where you stand when you have carried the overlays in and have no business being anywhere else in the room. He had been listening for 11 minutes. He had checked the same thing 4 times, because the first time he thought he was wrong, and the second time he thought his eyes were tired, and the third time he understood exactly what he was looking at and started running the arithmetic on what it would cost him to say so. Then he raised his hand, which was already the wrong thing to do, and he said, "Sir, that crossing isn't there." Nobody breathed. A colonel near the table found something interesting about his own boots. The major who owned that route on paper went the particular gray color of a man who has just realized that his name is written on the corner of the overlay in question. Somebody's chair creaked and then stopped creaking, as though the chair itself had thought better of it, and George Patton turned around. He did not say anything for what several men later described as a very long time, though it was probably 4 seconds. He looked at the corporal at the back of the room the way a man looks at weather coming in off a ridge. What he said next, and what he did about it before lunch the following day, is the reason anybody remembers Arthur Lindqvist's name at all. And it is not the reaction that anybody standing in that room was braced for. If you want more forgotten stories out of the Second World War, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Now, to understand why every man in that room went rigid, you have to understand what a 3rd Army staff briefing actually was, because it was not a meeting in any sense that would be recognizable today. It was not a discussion. Nobody was there to workshop anything. Information went up and orders came down, and the entire physical arrangement of the room enforced that. The general and the map at one end, the section chiefs in an arc around the table, everybody else in descending order of usefulness until you got to the back wall, where the men who carried things stood. The distance between a corporal and an army commander in August of 1944 was not measured in feet. It was measured in the entire vertical structure of the United States Army, and in that room the structure was visible on every collar in the building. The officers in that arc were not timid men. Most of them had been shot at. Several of them had opinions about that overlay. And here is the part that gets left out of the retelling. At least 2 of them, by their own later admission, had noticed that something about the eastern half of that map did not sit right, and had decided, in the space of about 1 breath, that it was not their problem to raise in front of an audience. You cannot really blame them for that, and I want to be honest about it rather than pretend otherwise. Patton had a documented history of removing officers he considered slow, or soft, or wrong in public. He had relieved men on the spot. He carried a reputation across the theater that arrived in a room before he did. Correcting him in front of 30 people was not a career risk in the abstract sense. It was a career risk in the sense that you might be commanding a replacement depot in Normandy by Thursday. That is the room Arthur Lindqvist put his hand up in. So why did the map matter enough for a corporal to gamble everything he had on it, because of what the 3rd Army was in the last week of August 1944, and because of what it was about to run out of? 3rd Army had spent that month doing something that had no real precedent in American military experience. It had broken out of the Normandy hedgerows and gone east across France at a speed that its own supply system could not follow. Divisions were covering ground in a day that planners had allocated a week for. Reconnaissance elements were routinely 40 or 50 miles ahead of where anybody expected them. And the whole thing was floating on gasoline that was being trucked up from beachheads hundreds of miles behind, in quantities that were falling further short every single day. By the final days of August, the fuel situation had gone from tight to critical. Tanks were being drained to fill other tanks. Columns were being halted, not because the Germans were in front of them, but because there was nothing left in the cans. Patton was making phone calls that his aides remembered for the rest of their lives, and the arithmetic was brutally simple. Every gallon that got burned going the wrong direction was a gallon that a combat command was not going to have when it needed to fight. Which means a map error in that particular week was not an embarrassment. It was fuel. Take a column of vehicles, several hundred of them, moving at night under blackout discipline on a road that a French farmer would call adequate. Now send that column toward a river crossing that the overlay says is at a certain point. The lead vehicle gets there and there is no bridge. There is a bank, and there is water, and there is no road down to the water, because there was never a bridge there in the first place. The lead vehicle stops. The column behind it does not know why it has stopped. The vehicles keep arriving and keep stacking up, and now you have a mile and a half of soft-skinned trucks and armor parked nose to tail on a road in the dark, with no way to turn around, burning fuel just to keep from freezing up, waiting on somebody at the front to figure out where the actual bridge is. Best case, you lose 3 hours and a lot of gasoline. Worst case, somebody with an aircraft or a battery of guns notices that you are all standing still in one place. That is what was sitting on that overlay. Not a technicality, not a nitpick from a kid who wanted to show off in front of a general. A stationary column at 4 a.m. with empty tanks and no way out. So here is the error itself, and it is worth going slowly here because it is the kind of thing that is genuinely easy to miss, and that is exactly why it was still on the board 11 minutes into a briefing attended by 30 professionals. The overlay in front of Patton had been assembled from captured and reprinted French mapping. That was standard. American forces in France were working almost entirely off French survey sheets that had been photographed, reprinted by British and American map depots, gridded, and pushed forward by the truckload. The underlying French survey work was excellent, some of the best in the world. The problem was never the accuracy of the original sheets. The problem was the seams. French national mapping was drawn on a Lambert projection, and France was not covered by one single Lambert zone. It was covered by several, stacked north to south, each with its own origin. Inside any one zone, the coordinates were consistent and correct. Cross the boundary between two zones, and the grid on one sheet does not agree with the grid on the sheet next to it. Not by a lot, but by enough. Layer on top of that the reality of how these overlays got made in the field. A section would take the sheets covering tomorrow's ground, butt them together on a table, tape them, and trace the route across the join. If both sheets came from the same series and the same zone, that worked fine, and nobody ever thought about it again. If they did not, then everything traced on the far side of that tape line was quietly displaced. On that particular overlay, the eastern sheet had come from an older reprint of a different series. The route ran across the seam, and the river crossing that Patton's grease pencil was resting on, the one the lead elements were supposed to reach before first light, was plotted roughly 800 meters upstream of the bridge that actually existed. 800 meters. On a map board, less than the width of your thumb. On the ground, in the dark, with fuel gauges reading empty, the difference between a crossing and a riverbank. Now, how does a corporal spot that when two colonels and a brigadier do not? He spots it because he was not reading the map the way they were reading it. They were reading the route. He was reading the paper. Lindqvist was attached to a topographic engineer detachment. His war, up to that morning, had consisted almost entirely of paper. Compiling sheets, checking registration on reproduced overlays, running the presses that turned out map sets for units that needed them yesterday, carrying finished work to headquarters and standing at the back of rooms until somebody told him he could leave. It is not a glamorous job, and nobody has ever made a film about it. It is also the reason armies arrive where they are supposed to arrive. And the thing about doing that work every day is that you stop looking at maps as pictures of places. You start looking at them as documents. You read the margins the way a mechanic listens to an engine. Series designation. sheet number, survey date, reprint date, projection, grid zone, contour interval, and whether it is stated in meters or feet, because getting that wrong has killed people. You develop a physical reflex about it, and after a few hundred sheets, you can feel a bad join the way you can feel a warped floorboard through your shoe. And I want to defend, briefly, the people who put that error on the board, because the version of this story where a lazy staff officer got sloppy is both unfair and much less interesting than what actually happened. Follow the paper. Somewhere in the 1920s, a French survey party stood in that river valley with a theodolite and did careful, honest work, and their measurements went into a sheet that was correct in every respect for the zone it was drawn in. 20 years later, that sheet gets photographed in England, gridded for military use, run off in enormous quantities, and loaded onto a truck. It crosses the Channel. It sits in a depot in Normandy. It goes forward to an army map section that is now 400 miles from where anybody planned it would be, because the front has been running east faster than the supply chain can follow. At that map section, somewhere past midnight, a group of men who have slept perhaps 9 hours across the last 3 days are told that the axis of advance for tomorrow has changed again, and that headquarters needs the overlay by 0600. They pull the sheets covering tomorrow's ground. 2 of them cover it. They tape the sheets, they trace the route, they letter the phase lines, they roll it up, and somebody carries it up the road in the dark. Nobody in that chain did anything wrong in any way you could put on a charge sheet. The surveyor was right. The reprint was right. The men at the table did the job they were trained to do, at the speed they were ordered to do it, with the sheets they were given, and the sheets they were given happened to straddle a boundary that does not announce itself, and that has no visible effect on the tabletop whatsoever. The tape line looks perfectly innocent. The road on one sheet meets the road on the other, and the join looks fine, because the roads themselves are drawn beautifully. That is what makes this class of error so nasty. It does not look like a mistake. It looks like a map, and by the time it reached that briefing room, it had accumulated the one property that makes bad information almost impossible to kill, which is authority. It was drawn on official paper. It had passed through a professional section. It had been reviewed by officers whose entire job is reviewing things. Every set of hands it touched added a layer of credibility that had nothing to do with whether the thing was true, and by the time it was pinned to a board with a general's grease pencil on it, questioning it required questioning everybody who had already signed off. That is exactly how errors of this kind survive, and it is not unique to 1944, and if you have ever worked anywhere at all, you have watched a wrong number gather momentum through a building for precisely the same reasons. So it got to the board. 11 minutes into the briefing, it was still there. That morning, what caught Lindqvist first was not the marginal data at all. It was the trees. Pinned to the board beside the operational overlay was an aerial photo mosaic of the same ground, flown 2 days earlier. Standard practice, and honestly the most useful thing in the room, because a photograph does not have a projection problem. A photograph just has whatever was there when the shutter opened. Lindqvist, standing at the back with nothing to do but look, noticed that the edge of a wood on the overlay and the edge of the same wood on the photograph were not in the same place relative to the river. Woods do change. They get cut, they get shelled, they get replanted. But they do not politely slide sideways in one direction, altogether, while the road bends, stay put. So he looked at the seam. He found the tape. He read the marginal blocks on both sheets, which he could see clearly enough from where he was standing because he had helped print one of them. Different series, different zone. And the route ran straight across the join, and the crossing point sat on the far side of it. He worked out the displacement in his head, roughly, and got something in the neighborhood of 800 meters. Then he did it again, and got the same answer. Then he did it a third time, hoping for a different answer, and did not get one. And then came the part of this story that I think about more than any other part, and it is the part that has nothing to do with maps. He had to decide, Understand that he had somewhere between 1 and 2 minutes. The briefing was moving. Once the general finished the phase lines and moved on to the next section, the overlay would be rolled, the corrections would be distributed, and the thing would be in the hands of division staffs by afternoon. After that, correcting it means unwinding a day of work in front of the people who did that work. Before that, correcting it means opening your mouth in a room where you are furniture. We tend to talk about physical courage in these stories. Men going up a beach, men going into a tree line. That is real, and I am not diminishing it. But there is a different animal entirely, and it lives in conference rooms, and most of us fail it most of the time. It is the courage required to be right out loud in front of people who can end you for it, when staying quiet costs you absolutely nothing that you personally will ever have to pay, because that is the honest math of that moment. If Lindqvist says nothing, nothing happens to Lindqvist. He goes back to the map section. He eats. He sleeps 4 hours. Sometime the next night, a column he will never see stops on a road he will never drive, and the men in it burn fuel they cannot spare and lose hours they cannot get back, and not one of them will ever know that a corporal in a headquarters building 3 days earlier noticed the tape line on a map and decided it was not his place. The bill would have arrived. It would just have arrived somewhere else, addressed to someone else. He put his hand up. Now, about the silence that followed, because it lasted longer than it should have, and there is something in it worth sitting with. 30 men in a room, and each of them running a private assessment of what they were about to watch. Some of them were bracing for an explosion, because they had seen explosions from that man over less. Some of them were doing a fast inventory of whether their own initials were anywhere near that overlay. And at least a couple of them, the ones who had felt the same itch about that eastern sheet and swallowed it, were sitting there with a very specific feeling in their stomach, the one where somebody else has just done the thing you decided not to do. I do not think those men were cowards. That is too easy. They were men who understood the rules of the room they were standing in, and made a rational calculation about the cost of breaking them, and the calculation was correct, in the narrow sense that it would probably have cost them something. What they got wrong was who ends up paying when everybody in the room is rational at the same time, which is in fact the whole problem with an army, or a company, or any organization at all, where the man with the most rank is presumed to be the most correct. Everybody makes the same sensible individual decision, and the sensible individual decisions add up to a column parked in the dark on the wrong side of a river. Patton knew this. Not in a soft way, and not because he was a generous man, because by most accounts he was not. He knew it because it is an operational fact, and he had spent his professional life around commands that had it and commands that did not. His own view of it was blunt. He wrote and said repeatedly that he wanted subordinates who would tell him what needed doing, not men who would wait to be told. He was contemptuous of staffs that filtered information for the comfort of the man receiving it, and he had watched what that produced. An army where the truth has to climb the chain of command, one comfortable rank at a time, is an army that will eventually receive a beautiful, unanimous, entirely wrong picture of what is happening in front of it. And by that August, he had a very close look at the alternative, because the enemy was demonstrating it. The German command structure by 1944 had contracted around one man's certainty about maps, and the results were visible on the ground everywhere Third Army went. Positions held because withdrawal was forbidden. Counterattacks launched into strength that everybody at the front could see and nobody at the top would hear about. The Germans did not lose in France for lack of professional competence. Their staff work was superb. They lost, in significant part, because the information going up had been curved to fit what the man at the top wanted it to say. Patton had a temper, and he had a mouth, and he had an unhelpful habit of saying things in public that his superiors had to clean up for weeks. But he was not stupid about this. He needed the maps to be right, and he understood that maps only stay right if somebody in the room is willing to say when they are not. Which brings us back to a corporal with his hand in the air and 30 officers waiting to see what happens to him. Stay with me here, because the next 90 seconds are the whole story. Patton looked at him. Then he looked at the map. Then he looked back at him, and the men who were there agreed on what came next, which was 2 words. Show me. Not a question. Not an invitation to explain himself from where he stood. An instruction to come to the front of the room and put his hand on the map, in front of everybody, which is either the beginning of a promotion or the most public dismantling of a man's career that anybody in that building was ever going to witness. Nobody watching had any idea which. Lindqvist walked up. Past the arc of chairs. Past the colonels. There is a version of this in my head where he is calm, and there is another version where his legs have gone to water, and I suspect the truth is that he was doing what people actually do in those moments, which is functioning normally on the outside, while some ancient part of the brain screams steadily throughout. He got to the board. And then he did the single smartest thing he did all day, which was to say the thing in the fewest possible words. He put his finger on the tape seam. He said the 2 sheets were from different series and different grid zones. He said the route crossed the join. He said the crossing point on the overlay was displaced from the actual bridge by something on the order of 800 meters, and that the bridge was downstream, not up. Then he pointed at the photo mosaic and showed the tree line that did not agree with the overlay, which was the part anybody in the room could verify with their own eyes in about 4 seconds. And then he stopped talking. That matters more than people appreciate. He did not apologize. He did not pad it with sirs and possiblies, and I could be wrong abouts. He also did not editorialize about how it had happened or whose section had let it through, which would have turned a technical correction into an accusation and would have gone very differently for him. He stated the discrepancy, showed the proof, and shut his mouth. Patton did not look at him while he spoke. He looked at where the finger was, then at the photograph, then at the bottom corner of the sheet where the marginal data sits, the block of small print that tells you what you are actually holding, which almost nobody in an operations room ever reads, because it is the map equivalent of the fine print on a lease. He read it. In a room of 30 people, with a war going on and a phase line to finish, the commanding general of the Third Army stood there and read the marginal data on a French survey sheet. Then he straightened up and said, to nobody in particular, "He's right." And then something happened that I find more revealing than the promotion. Honestly. And it is the thing that almost never gets told, because it is the absence of an event rather than an event. Nothing else happened. He did not deliver a speech. He did not turn around and take the skin off the officers who had let it through, which he was entirely capable of doing, and which several of them were visibly expecting. He did not make a performance of the moment, or use the corporal as a stick to beat his staff with, which would have been the easy move, and would have felt satisfying, and would have guaranteed that no enlisted man in that headquarters ever opened his mouth again as long as the war lasted. He also did not do the bureaucratically tidy thing, which would have been to hand the whole business to a major, and let the correction be made by somebody of appropriate rank, so that the record would show a major catching it. That happens constantly, in every organization on Earth, and it is how good information gets laundered into the right person's name. He had the seam checked. He had the crossing replotted onto the correct sheet. He asked, apparently, how many other overlays had gone out with joins across a zone boundary, which is the right question, and which sent somebody's afternoon straight into the bin. And then he went back to the phase lines and finished the briefing. The whole thing took under 5 minutes. The route got fixed. The column that went east that night went toward a bridge that was there. And that would be the end of it. A small correction in a long war, except for what showed up the next morning. Lindqvist found out from his own section sergeant, a man named Lyle Mercer, who had been standing along the wall for the whole briefing and had not said one word for the rest of that day. Mercer came and found him at the presses sometime after breakfast and told him the paperwork had gone through the previous evening and that he was a sergeant. No formation, no ceremony. Nobody made a speech about the value of speaking up. In an army moving that fast, there was no time for any of that, and I suspect that was somewhat the point. Mercer, by every account of the man, delivered the news with an expression that sat somewhere between proud and deeply unsettled, which is exactly the correct expression for a career non-commissioned officer watching one of his corporals get a stripe for correcting an army commander in public. Both feelings are legitimate. A sergeant's entire professional life is built on the idea that the chain of command is not a suggestion. And here was proof that on one specific morning, in one specific room, it had been. Lindqvist's first question, and this is my favorite detail in the entire story, was not about the stripe. He asked whether the crossing had been corrected on the operational overlay or only on the briefing copy. Think about what that question tells you. He had just been promoted by General Patton in a theater where a corporal could go an entire war without the army commander learning his name, and the thing occupying his mind was whether the fix had propagated to the document that the drivers would actually be handed. Mercer told him it had. And Lindqvist said something like "all right," and went back to work. So what was Patton actually putting a stripe on? It was not the map knowledge. That is worth being clear about, because it is the obvious reading, and it is wrong. Map knowledge was Lindqvist's job. Knowing about Lambert zones and sheet series and grid seams was the baseline competence expected of any man in a topographic detachment, the way knowing how to strip a machine gun is the baseline for a machine gunner. You do not get promoted for doing your job correctly. You get to keep doing your job. What got the stripe was the 90 seconds before he raised his hand, because the useful thing in that room, the genuinely rare commodity, was not the information. Two other men in that building had a version of the same information, and it stayed in their heads. The rare thing was a man who would put it into the air at the exact moment when the personal cost of speaking was maximum, and the personal cost of silence was zero. That is a specific trait. It does not correlate with rank, it does not correlate with intelligence, and you cannot train it into somebody in 6 weeks. Patton had spent 30 years in an institution that systematically selects against it, and when it walked into his briefing room wearing corporal's stripes, he recognized it immediately and paid for it before the sun went down. Because a promotion is not a reward. A promotion is a signal, sent to everyone who hears about it, about what this organization actually rewards, as opposed to what it says on the wall. And that signal traveled. It traveled through that headquarters within a day, the way anything interesting travels through a headquarters, which is to say faster than any official communication ever devised. Every clerk and every driver and every enlisted man in that building learned that in this outfit, if you were certain and you were right, and you could prove it in under a minute, the fact that you were nobody was not a disqualification. You cannot measure what that is worth. But every organization has an answer to the question of what happens to the person who says the uncomfortable true thing, and everybody inside the organization knows the answer, and they know it long before it is ever tested. Most places the answer is that the person gets quietly damaged. In the Third Army, that August, the answer for one morning was a stripe. Now let me tell you about the man, because he was not a symbol, and it is a bit obscene to treat him as one. Arthur Lindqvist was 23. Duluth, Minnesota, which in the 1920s and 30s was a working town built on ore and water and coal. His father Niels had come over from Sweden as a boy and spent his adult life working the ore docks, and then the railway that fed them, which is the kind of job that gives a man a permanent squint and a bad back by 50. His mother ran the house and, for several years during the worst of the Depression, ran a boarding table for single men working the docks, which meant Arthur grew up doing arithmetic on food for 11 people, and understanding early that being precise about small quantities is not fussiness, it is how everyone eats. He was not a scholar. He was decent at mathematics and terrible at English composition, and a teacher at his high school pointed him at drafting, which turned out to be the thing. He did 2 winters at a technical institute learning surveying and drafting, and then he got taken on as a rodman with a county road survey crew, which meant standing in Minnesota weather holding a stick while an older man squinted at him through a transit and occasionally shouted. That job is where he actually got educated, and it had very little to do with instruments. Field survey teaches you one lesson over and over until it becomes part of your nervous system. The map is a claim, and the ground is the fact, and when they disagree, the map is what is wrong. Every man who has done that work carries it. You never fully trust a piece of paper again. You look at a beautiful, clean drawing, and some quiet part of you asks who measured this, and when, and how tired were they. He had been on that crew for a bit over a year when the draft found him. He had a younger sister named Ingrid, who wrote him long letters about people he only half remembered. There had been a girl called Ruth Amundsen, and there had been an understanding of sorts. And in 1943 she married somebody who worked at the shipyard, and he had mostly stopped thinking about it, in the way that men mostly stop thinking about things. His plan for afterward was not dramatic. Get the license. Get on with the county or the state highway department if they were hiring, and if they were not hiring, he would go back to the crew and wait until they were. Buy a house eventually. That was it. That was the whole ambition, and there is nothing small about it. He went back to the map section that morning with one more stripe and the same eyes he had walked in with, and the headquarters moved east about a week later, and the tables and the boards and the presses all went with it. Here is the frustrating part, and I would rather say it plainly than pretend otherwise. We cannot tell you what that correction saved. You cannot count the cost of an event that did not occur. There is no report filed anywhere that says a combat command did not stack up on a riverbank at 4 a.m. No after-action review documents the hours that were not lost, or the fuel that was not burned, or the vehicles that were not sitting stationary in the open at first light. The whole category of catastrophe that gets prevented by somebody catching something in time is invisible by definition, which is why the people who do that work almost never get recognized for it, and why organizations chronically underinvest in them. What can be said is narrower, and it is still worth saying. A column that was going to be sent toward a crossing that did not exist was instead sent toward a crossing that did. It got over the river. Whatever happened to those men afterward, and this was 1944 in France, so plenty happened, it did not happen because they spent a night parked on the wrong bank of a river, burning gasoline that the entire army was already out of. I want to be careful about one more thing before we finish, because these stories have a way of turning a complicated man into a greeting card. Patton was not a good listener as a general rule. He was not humble, and he was not patient, and he did not routinely welcome correction, and if you want the full picture, you have to hold that alongside this. There are documented occasions where he was wrong and would not hear it. There are men he treated appallingly. 2 weeks in a hospital tent in Sicily in 1943 nearly finished his career for exactly the reasons you would expect, and the man who slapped those soldiers is the same man who stood in that room and read the fine print on a French map, because a corporal told him to. So this is not a story about a wise commander. It is a story about a specific instinct that happened to be operating that morning, in a man who was, by that stage of the war, running an army on fumes and terrain and speed, and who knew with total clarity that his entire method depended on the paper being correct. Third Army moved the way it moved across France because of 100 unglamorous things underneath the headlines. Fuel discipline, signals that kept up, engineers who bridged rivers faster than anyone thought possible, and map sections in requisitioned school buildings, printing sheets through the night so that a driver in a truck at 2 a.m. could be handed a strip that told him the truth about where the road went. Speed is not recklessness. Speed is what you get when the information underneath the plan is accurate enough that you can afford to commit hard, early, and not look back. The moment that information starts getting shaded to please the man receiving it, the speed becomes the most dangerous thing you own, because now you are committing hard and early to a picture of the ground that is not the ground, which is why a corporal reading marginal data on a map sheet was, for about 90 seconds on one morning in August 1944, the most operationally important person in the 3rd United States Army. So, was Patton right to do it? There is a real argument that he was not, and it deserves better than a straw man. An army runs on the chain of command, and the chain is not decoration. If the signal that goes out is that any man at any level can interrupt an army commander in a staff briefing when he believes he knows better, You have handed every confident 22-year-old in the theater a license to relitigate his orders in public. And most of them will not be right. Most of the time, the man with the rank has context the man without it does not have, and the whole reason the structure exists is that armies cannot pause to debate at every level while the enemy is still moving. Reward that behavior, and you may get 1 corrected map and 100 wasted arguments. There is also a version of this that says Patton got lucky. That if Lindqvist had been wrong, or had been right, but unable to prove it in 40 seconds, the story ends with a corporal transferred out that afternoon, and 30 officers taking the obvious lesson, and nobody makes a video about it 80 years later. And then there is the other argument, which I will admit I find harder to get around. An organization that punishes accuracy and rewards silence does not stay accurate, it stays quiet. And a quiet organization eventually walks a column down a road that only exists on paper, and then writes a report afterward about the fog of war, and every single person who could have prevented it will have had a completely reasonable explanation for why it was not their place to speak. What Patton did that morning cost him nothing. 5 minutes of a briefing and a signature on a promotion. What he bought with it was a headquarters full of men who now knew, for a fact and not as a slogan, that being right was survivable. Tell me where you land on that, in the comments, because I go back and forth on it myself. And if you want more of these, the stories that never made it into the books because nothing exploded and nobody got a medal, and the whole thing turned on one man deciding to open his mouth, subscribe and stick around. There are a lot of them.